Hi, I'm Amy.
And I'm Kirsty.
And this is our podcast covering the highs, lows and realities of parenting a child with neurodiversity.
Each week we'll be sharing updates from our lives and hearing from a variety of guests about their advice and experiences.
This is Love Needs No Words. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Love Needs No Words. With us this week is Jessica Kirton, who is a private occupational therapist based in Buckinghamshire. We're both very excited to talk to you, Jessica, as we have lots of questions around all things occupational therapy. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
So to start, what are some of the things that we should as parents be looking out for in our children when thinking about an occupational therapy assessment, and I guess some of the difficulties that our children might be having?
Yeah, so there's several different areas that you could kind of start to think about. So one of them is something called fine motor skills. So that's the small movements of the hands and fingers. So that could be things like writing, using scissors, or even kind of mark making for more of the early years children, or it could be that they're struggling to kind of play with smaller toys. So you might see things like that, or difficulties with their pencil grip, or using kind of utensils, toothbrushes, or little bits kind of like that. There's the bigger movements of the body, so kind of your gross motor skills. So it could be that you might see that at the playground, they might kind of avoid going on certain equipment, or they might avoid kind of PE or sports and struggle with things like balance, ball skills, or maybe their kind of core strength, and you'll see that kind of slouched posture or getting very tired during kind of physical activities. There's the big area of kind of sensory processing issues, and that could be a kind of multitude of things really. Ones that I kind of hear about a lot are the kind of sensitivity to sounds, or it might be struggling with different kind of textures, not wanting to kind of do grooming activities, getting very upset by those sorts of things. So those are the children that I would call more sort of oversensitive to particular kind of sensory stimuli. And then there might be other children that kind of seek extra movement. So you might see those kind of children being very much kind of on the go all the time, maybe doing a lot more kind of risk-taking behaviours, quite heavy-handed, or kind of appearing sort of clumsy. Sensory processing I could talk about for a really, really long time. But that's like, there's a lot of kind of areas within that that you might see, or not kind of noticing pain, not reacting when their name is called, or for a lot of children that I get a lot of referrals around kind of picky eating and things like that as well. There are kind of other areas in sort of self-care and daily living skills. You might see your child really kind of struggling to manage like buttons or shoelaces, or pulling on their clothing. It might be again around kind of eating, drinking, those sorts of skills that could be presenting as difficulties. It could be around kind of more executive functioning and their attention as well. So there's kind of a whole massive area. So in terms of kind of the older children and that executive function, you might kind of spot that more with like following a timetable, or having their belongings organised for the day, being able to pack a bag, and because it covers that big wide age range for occupational therapy, that there's so many skills that you could be looking out for. And I think the key thing I would say is if it's impacting their function. So if they're struggling to function, because OT is all about occupation and function and the ability to kind of engage, that's when you might need to think about that occupational therapy assessment. If they're just a little bit overactive, but it helps to kind of go to the park a little bit more, it might just be that they just need a little bit more movement. It's when you can't then engage in activity that then those kind of real struggles are there, and you might want to kind of get that occupational therapy assessment. But I think there's always that option, particularly if you are getting a private assessment, just give that occupational therapist a ring and say, this is what I'm seeing, and they'll be able to advise whether that assessment is something that would be valuable to have.
That's brilliant. I didn't realise, and I'm sure you'd agree, Kirst, there was so much that occupational therapy covers. Like, I'm really surprised actually at how much that you cover and look at. How important is it that if we notice any of these things, to get it sort of looked at earlier than later?
I do think early intervention is key, because the brain is more malleable at an earlier age, you're much more able to learn skills more quickly. And then the impact on things like kind of your self-esteem and confidence later in life as well. I think if you can kind of learn those skills as early as possible, or address those difficulties as early as possible, then you're not going to have so much of an impact on how that person is feeling when they can't do those things later. Just really addressing them quickly is so important. And that progress, I find with the early years, that progress just happens so much faster.
That's interesting. And I suppose it affects their confidence, doesn't it, when they struggle to be able to do these things. So being able to intervene at an earlier age, I guess, when our children have so much to deal with on a day-to-day basis anyway, is beneficial. I agree with Amy. I had absolutely no idea of how much occupational therapy covers before I kind of had to look into it for Max. And to be honest, before I went on this journey, I didn't even know occupational therapy was a thing. So I was literally having this conversation with my family earlier, two of whom work in the NHS and were fully aware of it, and the other two of us had quite openly said that we had no idea. And to be honest, even when I started going down the journey, I didn't realise that would be something that Max needed. I kind of just thought, oh, his gross motor is fine, like, you know, he can walk and he can run and such like. But actually, now I know so much more. His fine motor is affected. Actually, his gross motor is affected. So yeah, I've had to try and engage with occupational therapy for him as well, which is a whole different we'll get to that later in the podcast, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's thinking about occupational therapy, it sounds like it's something to do with like work or a job, but actually for children, it's any childhood occupation. It's any task that a child needs to be able to do and learn to then function later as an adult. So yeah, as we said, it encompasses such a wide range of things, but it can be hugely beneficial, I think.
And once we've rung to sort of make the referral, what's the sort of next stage of you sort of coming into the setting or the home, and, you know, how long are you there for, and what sort of things do you put in place?
So I would usually do kind of a telephone call, kind of an introductory tour with a parent to kind of talk about the sort of difficulties that they're seeing. I always send across a pre-assessment questionnaire so I can kind of gather that information first about what assessments might need to be completed, because there also could be a tendency to kind of over assess, and you don't really want to do that with a child either and cause them a lot more kind of stress and anxiety than they need to go through. It's picking out from that information what's the most important things that we need to look at here. And for some children, that I normally give kind of 1 to 2 hours for an assessment session, but also often do kind of another half an hour in school or at home, depending on what location the kind of bigger part of the assessment has been done. And that's talked through with the parent as well, in terms of where are the kind of biggest difficulties lying. For some children, it could be that that's within the home setting, for some it's in school, for some it's both. So just looking at kind of unpicking all of the pieces of the puzzle and finding out quite a lot of information before that assessment even begins, I think is really key to learn as much as possible before you get there, so that you can bring the right things as well. And I'll often bring a more sort of standardized assessment in terms of being able to kind of measure it against a norm, but have the option that you go off piste and you look at a range of different activities that are those functional tasks, so you can still see how they are with the gross and fine motor skills without it having to be a stressful timed test or specific number of whatever it might be, because that doesn't work for every child. And then following kind of that assessment piece, I then kind of piece together all of that information, put together a report and a program of strategies, and then do a follow-up consultation with parents to actually talk through that report, because I think often you can get that report and you're like, great, but what does this mean, or now what? And my reports are quite long. I am very guilty for writing quite extensive reports, but I think having that consultation to then talk through any questions, anything that might not be quite worded how it came across in like whatever conversation we might have had, or so to make sure that that report is actually right for the family and the child and really reflects the needs and the strengths of that child as well. So I do think it's really important to reflect what they're good at as well, and really say, because otherwise it can be a bit disheartening to just read a report of these are all the difficulties. Let's also think about what are they really, really good at.
Yeah, we read a lot of reports and we get a lot of reports that are quite negative feedback. So we're used to that. But I would be really impressed, I'm sure Kirsty would agree, to get an extensive report, because we really like to hone in on all the things that they need help with. And then do you work out from then how long you'd be working with that child? Sort of, I guess, dependent on what it is, how many weeks and months you'd need to be working alongside them.
Yeah, so I'd give a recommendation for how many kind of weeks I think they might need. But then again, I make that a discussion with the family, because sometimes it's not always financially viable or realistic in terms of how many other things that everybody has to do. So it would be looking at how that's going to work. And I offer it different kind of ways, because I think there are pluses and minuses of different ways of working. So for some families, I've done it so that it's maybe a fortnightly session, and then you have kind of like homework in between to practice some activities. Then the next session we'll see how that's gone. Did it work? Did it not work? Because with a lot of occupational therapy and the play activities, there is, especially with sensory processing, there is that kind of trial and error approach, because there is no one size fits all when it comes to the senses. It's a very personalized thing, and different strategies work for different children. And also you could do a strategy and it'll work 1 week, and then 3 weeks later it doesn't work anymore, because sometimes it's that the novelty's worn off, or sometimes it won't work straight away because there's an anxiety around trying something new. So I think that you do need kind of quite a block of sessions to get things right, particularly if it's sensory processing skills. It's slightly more straightforward with some of the more kind of functional skills, and that can be a little bit easier. But I think working together as a team is really, really important, and trying to get kind of schools on board, parents on board, because that one therapy session is really, really great. However, it's something that often needs to become kind of part of your lifestyle, practiced as much as possible, because the more you do something, the bigger change you're going to see.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing with our children. It's like repetition is so important, like doing the same thing over and over, and then suddenly it just clicks. But you must work with neurotypical children and SEND children. How does it differ, sort of working with both? Have you found a big difference?
I think there's a kind of a big difference in terms of the approach to therapy. So obviously it's going to be very different if you've got, say, a sort of non-verbal child versus your kind of mainstream child that's having a few difficulties, whereas with children with kind of more complex needs, again, I think a longer standing relationship might be needed, and I think there is more of that trial and error approach, because they often can't tell you whether they like something or not, and you've got to take it on all of the visuals that you're seeing, or using speech and language therapy strategies actually often alongside. So I've got like laminated cards of my activities, so that we can use that like a now and next board, and using a more kind of combined therapy approach with children. And sometimes the progress can be slightly slower, I would say, than the mainstream child, where it might click slightly quicker.
I think Amy can relate to this as well. Both of our children, I believe, have been referred for occupational therapy via the NHS, and have both been rejected for different reasons. It's really difficult then to know as a parent whether to go down the private route, and obviously that depends whether you can then fund it, but also when then is the best time to intervene. So an example of that is that Max struggles with his fine motor, so handwriting. He's quite delayed in his handwriting. He's really struggling with it. He's hypermobile as well, so that's causing problems with him being able to put pressure on pencil or pen. But I don't know when the best time is to actually intervene. For example, he's in reception, they are obviously practicing handwriting, but not lots. He will not engage with that at home whatsoever, however much I try. So it's kind of, okay, do I do it now, recognizing that early intervention is really key, or do I wait until actually there's a time where he might be more open to engaging with that therapy and we're likely to get more out of it? What's your thoughts on that?
I think that sometimes thinking about it as not necessarily having to practice that exact skill of handwriting over and over again, maybe thinking about what activities could actually support the grasp on the pencil, what activities could support the strength in the hands, and that could be lots of fun games where you are kind of like playing with little kind of toys where you have to pull and push them together. It could be that you do multi-sensory writing, so you get out your shaving foam, start writing letters and numbers in shaving foam or sand or paint or chalk, so it becomes more of a game than another task that I've got to do, another skill I've got to learn. And then it's just play, which you'd be doing with your child anyway. So I think rather than it being kind of, I've got to practice handwriting with them, just thinking about all of those play skills that might be related to it. Or it could be kind of playing with Play-Doh, it could be playing with putty, and doing lots of those kind of activities with the hands that might then help those skills to develop.
That's really good advice.
And Kirsty touched upon it a bit there, and I filled out the questionnaire online, to the NHS to get occupational therapy and been turned down 4 times now. Why do you think that it's so difficult to get an assessment on the NHS at the moment? What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's probably a lot of reasons behind that, being one of them being that there's sort of a high demand and limited resources, limited funding. There's also a high shortage of occupational therapists at the moment, so often services just don't have enough OTs to hold everyone and to be able to get those things done, and they have to then have some sort of priority list, and often that is the ones that are kind of really sort of high risk children, that they'll have to kind of cover first, which is really, really difficult and really frustrating, I realise, and being on a long waiting list for a long time, it is really hard. I know the NHS do provide a lot of those kind of information packs, which are really, really good to read, and the kind of free training that they do as well. And I know it's not the same as having an assessment and having sessions, but using those resources can be helpful as a starting point, and to kind of help you to see, because if you trial those activities kind of first, and then if they're really not working, either going back to the NHS, or if you're still kind of not getting there with the NHS, thinking about funding privately, because then you've tried everything that you can to try to support your child. And it is frustrating, and I think that's true of a lot of healthcare at the moment, isn't it? Even getting a doctor's appointment at the moment is pretty impossible, and hopefully the government will just find some funding somewhere and save the NHS. But it can be really difficult. There's often really strict referral criteria, and that can be quite difficult, and the referral process in itself is really difficult. There's long waiting times, so I think it comes down to it just being under-resourced and underfunded, really.
It's just such a shame, isn't it? And I think everyone would probably feel the same way, that you feel you see your child, or you must see older children as well. You see them struggling with things, and you desperately want them to get the help that will make such a difference to them. But obviously recognizing that it's just not a never-ending pot, is it? And so we kind of have to work with that, but it is difficult. You must have seen so many success stories though of working with children. Are there any that particularly stand out for you?
Find this a really difficult question to answer, because there's just I think there's just so many little kind of lovely stories, and I think some success looks different for everyone as well, which I think is the really lovely thing about it, is that for some children it is something that would be seemingly a small deal to another child. So like, for instance, this one I have worked with, I wrote a small book of like kind of poems about something called interoception. So being aware of your inner body signals. And just from reading that book, then this child was able to go to the doctors and say to the doctors what was wrong with them, because they could start to understand and to feel it in their body. So that one was a really nice one. And actually I'd not done that much to support them other than give them this little book, but it was a tiny little change with a big impact. Or like another one I've been working with, I heard back from the nursery, and I'd shown them kind of like a deep pressure strategy. So like where they've got kind of a big weighted blanket and a vibrating cushion, and just giving that pressure to the body. And where this child gets quite distressed a lot of the time, they said to me, oh, we did that strategy you showed us, it calms him down, we've been able to have better days at nursery now, and he's a happier child. So it's all those tiny little pieces, I think, rather than, I just couldn't pick one child. I think there's just so many special moments that you get being an OT, and working so closely with the families and school and nursery staff, that it's hard to pick out one person.
It must be so amazing, because it doesn't just benefit the setting, the nursery or the school, but it benefits obviously the child and the parents that sat at home worrying about, what each day will bring with their child. So what an amazing thing to be able to do and give back to families and the children as well. So Alex is actually needing an occupational therapy assessment, so this has come at a good time for me, because he struggles with sensory processing. So to actually get access to a SEND school, I need to provide an OT assessment based on him eating sand and Play-Doh, or whatever sensory things they have out. And they've been able to help slightly by giving him breadsticks, but there's still quite a long way to go. So what sort of things, I guess, would you put in place for something like that to kind of help?
So there are possibly lots of things that you could kind of look at. It could be kind of looking at whether that is just a seeking for the mouth, or whether there is a tactile component in that he's not getting the feedback from like hands and fingers, to then so he's then kind of putting things in his mouth to get that information that he's not getting from his hands and fingers. So lots of the kind of sensory bins, tactile activities, to see. And I'd often use things that are edible, so that then it's not a big deal if it does go in his mouth, that's fine. Also, there are kind of a lot of sort of oral motor work, vibration to the mouth and jaw can often be really helpful as well. So giving that kind of intense tactile input in another way can be really, really helpful. Or looking at kind of, can you put something really cold in his mouth, like just getting an ice cube, to just give a really, really intense amount of oral feedback and see how that goes. And you can do things kind of like massage to the mouth and jaw. Those sorts of activities can sometimes be really helpful. Or your kind of blowing and sucking activities, because that provides that kind of proprioceptive feedback to the mouth and jaw. So that working of the muscles can often be quite regulating.
That's really fascinating.
Interesting.
I'm really interested in that as well, because Alex is eating things, and that's obviously a sensory thing, but again oral. But Max is a biting child, so he bites, and he does it it's almost like a fight or flight response when he's in a situation. As an occupational therapist, would you work with children who bite, like beyond obviously typical years, and put strategies in place for that?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's thinking about that overall state of regulation there. So as you were saying, that fight and flight response, and trying to make that wave of regulation smaller, so that you can get sort of more strategies in there to make the wave smaller, so that you're not getting into that big kind of fight and flight response as often. And looking at those kind of alternative ways of providing, because biting gives that proprioceptive feedback. So that's often something that children will do. And that's something that I see a lot of the time. So giving that kind of proprioceptive feedback to the whole body and finding those regulation strategies can be really helpful.
So what kind of strategies would you suggest for children who are doing things like that?
So I think it depends on the child, and kind of unpicking that situation as well and seeing what are the triggers for that starting. So is it because it's a over response to something that's happening in the environment? Is it I'm feeling out of control, and so I'm going to seek control by doing this, and that's going to make this activity stop? So it's finding out kind of what the triggers are, as well as then the proprioceptive activities are the ones that I would always say they're your kind of like fail safe. So whether a child is too heightened or is in a kind of lower state of arousal, proprioceptive strategies generally bring us to that middle ground. So that's your kind of pulling, pushing kind of games. It could be body weight exercises. It could be doing, for older children, your press ups, your weights, your those sorts of strategies. Or for younger children, like I often use a lot of kind of therapy ball activities, and a lot of kind of the kind of heavy muscle work with them. So your trampolines, you're going to the playground, all those kinds of things provide that proprioceptive feedback and can just help make them more regulated overall throughout the day.
Yeah. It's really fascinating, isn't it? How you think, well, I've sometimes thought, okay, fine, so it's a situation relating to him biting. Okay, so that an oral thing only? But what you're saying is actually loads of parts of their body and overall well-being influence, just one particular thing, like if they're biting or if they're eating something. But actually there's so many things that play into that, and so many things you have to consider, and are able to put in place as strategies to be able to kind of influence that and hopefully make it better.
I sort of think about it is that, like, when we're stressed, we might go for the chocolate or go for the wine, always. The tea. If someone's upset, what do you do? Would you like a cup of tea? Because our oral sense actually has one of the most receptors in the whole of our body, so it is where we will often seek our regulation. So the biting, it's a bigger thing, and it's a way of saying I'm not regulated and I need your help.
It's so interesting, and without occupational therapy it would actually be in some cases near impossible to kind of get to what is causing it. So for me it's really highlighted the importance of what you do and getting that help early. So if there's anybody out there that's thinking they could do with some occupational therapy assessment either at school or at home, what's the best way to get in contact with you for more details?
So you can either go on my website, which is www.occupationaltherapist.com. So that's OCTOPATIONAL. Hopefully I've spelled that right. Not very good at spelling out loud. Or the same for my email address. So it's occupationaltherapist@gmail.com.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on, Jessica. Honestly, I've learned so much, and it's the first thing I'm going to do tomorrow is sort this out, because it's so important that they get the help early, and it's blown my mind how much you do as well.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. Same as me. Just such an insight into how there's so many ways that you can influence in helping these children. And yeah, it's fascinating. I need to you've inspired me to not wait to get help for Max's handwriting, so thank you.
No problem at all. I can always send you over like some handwriting strategies and things like that.
That'd be lovely. Thank you. That'd be great.
Thank you so much, Jessica.
Thank you.